Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I am professor of history and chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. Welcome to our third season of Documents in Detail, teachingamericanhistory.org's webinar series. In each episode, we'll do a deep dive into a single document discussing the historical, literary, and rhetorical aspects of said document, while also analyzing its impact on American history, people, and thought. TeachingAmericanHistory.org is a project of the Ashbrook Center, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization based at Ashland University. We provide a variety of programs and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics, all based on primary documents. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. The documents we will be discussing tonight, as is the case with all of our webinars, are drawn from the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database, available for your use at tah.org. You can participate in the discussion by typing your questions into the chat window at the bottom of your screen at any time, and we will do our best to answer them expeditiously. The subject of today's program is James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance against Religious Assessments. To help discuss it this evening are Dr. David Tucker, Senior Fellow at the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University and Director of Faculty for its teacher programs, and Dr. Sarah Morgan Smith, Ashbrook Center Fellow, General Editor of Ashbrook's Core Documents Collections, and Co-Director of the Center's Religion in American History and Politics Project. Welcome to both of you. I'm delighted you could be with us. So, just to start us off, would each of you like to say a few words about why this document is important? Why include this in the relative handful of documents that we will be emphasizing over the course of this academic year?
Do you want to go first, Sarah?
Sure, I can go first. So I think that Madison's Remonstrance is significant on two dimensions. One is just the fact that Madison is the author, and he's such a significant player in shaping particularly the legal development of the new nation, the author of the Constitution, or the father of the Constitution. But more significantly, I think, is his role in shaping the Bill of Rights, and of course, the text of the First Amendment, which becomes critical to the American understanding of religious liberty. And so knowing what Madison will go on to do in the First Amendment, I think makes the Remonstrance very significant, because it helps us understand some of where he's coming from, and maybe what he had in mind in terms of framing that document. So that's one element, is just that Madison is the author. And then the other is that it shows us so clearly that religious liberty has benefits for both religion and for civil society.
Okay. So in a way, we're getting the backstory to the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights here. Very interesting. David Tucker.
Yeah, I would just add that in the Everson case, one of the very first times the Supreme Court fully applied the First Amendment to the states, it's the Memorial and Remonstrance is one of the key documents that guided the justices, and it continues to be cited in that way. So I believe actually in the Hobby Lobby case, a recent case, even though it wasn't fought directly on First Amendment grounds, both justices, the dissent and the majority opinion, referred to the Memorial and Remonstrance, or to Madison's writings. So it's been very influential in court decisions.
Okay, so could you give us a little bit of context for this document? What was going on? Tell us a little about the bill that Madison is responding to here.
David, do you want to start?
Sure. There was the background for this, of course, is that there was an established church in Virginia, the Episcopalian Church of the Revolution. And then the question became, what do we do with this established church? And as Madison references the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which called for religious liberty, and it seemed to him and to some others that this implied no establishment, whereas there were some others. Patrick Henry, he was prominent, obviously, in the Revolution, and yet was devoted to the Anglican Church and then to the Episcopal Church. So Henry was one of the people who wanted to provide state support for the church. So I don't know if you want to add, and so a proposal for state support had come to the Virginia Assembly, and Madison and those who opposed it, I guess you could say, maneuvered legislatively to prevent a vote and to give time, as Madison refers to in the Remonstrance, to give time to kind of collect the opinion of the Virginia people about this proposal. And it was in that time that Madison wrote and circulated the Memorial and Remonstrance, and other people circulated petitions as well. And those eventually ended up back with the Assembly and turned the Assembly against the notion of supporting the Episcopalian Church.
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what David said is that Henry, at some point in this process, to try and either sideline Madison or to get around some of those critiques, opens it up to allow people to support whatever church, recognized church, but whatever church that they wanted to, not just the Anglican Church. And so I think what makes the Remonstrance really interesting is that its objection is philosophical, right? It's not just to the idea of an established church, it's the idea of a state collecting taxes and using them for religious purposes. And so it kind of broadens that discussion up in a way that we don't see in some of the other colonies and then states.
Yeah, my understanding, as you say, is that the bill that Patrick Henry proposed would have had tax money taken from everyone, but then that would be used to fund Christian teaching of whatever sect the taxpayer preferred, and that is, I'm sure, what Madison has in mind when, gosh, I'm not going to be able to find it right now, but he said, look, this sounds like it's even-handed among sects, but really it's promoting the Christian religion at the expense of others. And if we allow this principle by which Christianity can be supported at public expense, but no other faiths can, then it's only a matter of time before we start picking and choosing among sects. I'm interested in the very first line of this. I'm not to the Honorable General Assembly, but we the subscribers. Why use that term? Either of you, feel free to jump in. Don't be so polite.
Well, I don't attach any significance to it other than, kind of a literal, we who have signed our names below.
Okay. All right. Good. That makes sense.
I mean, I think it is important. It's interesting in how this process worked, in the sense that there were a number of petitions circulated, and people really, you did sign your name, and there your scribble was carried to the Assembly. So it's quite literally a kind of process of collecting signatures. And
yeah. It hadn't occurred to me that subscribers literally means the undersigned. Yeah. Here's a question we have from Jeremy. How fundamental do you think this belief of religious liberty was to Madison the man? Was it more of an Enlightenment political idea or a reflection of his own personal beliefs?
So this is a controversial question. Different Madison scholars fall out differently on this. There are people who are deeply committed to the idea that Madison was personally agnostic, bordering on atheistic, and so want him to be this idealized Enlightenment thinker who is using religious liberty as a cover for trying to get religion out of the public square. I actually happen to think that's wrong. I think that Madison genuinely believed that there were valuable elements in religion that could best be appreciated and could best do their public good if they were completely divorced from the state. And so I think that he believes religious liberty is an essential principle, because it means that religions don't have an incentive to become corrupt and to meddle in troublesome ways. And so because they don't have that incentive, then they're kind of free to develop those virtuous elements that he thinks they do have.
Okay.
I think that I tend to agree with Sarah without claiming really to understand, of course, Madison's most private thoughts about his relationship to God. But it's clear that I think that there was a difference between Madison and Jefferson on this point. Jefferson was more reluctant than Madison to acknowledge that religion could do good or had any kind of positive political effect. And I think when you read Jefferson, they were so close and supported one another in so many ways. I think that you do see there's a difference there. As a practical matter, they both, for the reasons Sarah gave, they both wanted to keep religion out of political life, but I think they had slightly different motivations, personal motivations for that with regard to their own religious opinions.
What do you know about the substance of Madison's religious beliefs? Could he be characterized like Jefferson as a deist?
So there's a really good book, and it's a very slim little volume, and I think it might just be James Madison and Religion is the title of it, by a scholar whose name I'm not remembering right now, which I apologize to the unnamed scholar for forgetting them. But the book is really good and makes the case that Madison, although raised, in the Anglican establishment in Virginia, when he goes off to Princeton and studies with John Witherspoon, who is an ordained Presbyterian minister, becomes sort of more Calvinistic in his understanding of the world. And I think, if we look at even his secular writings, the view that he presents of mankind, right, that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. This sort of, we have to be kind of a little bit cynical, a little bit aware of men's propensity to do bad things to one another. So I think he absorbs a Presbyterian mindset, and then he does go to religious services, but not in a particularly studious or careful way. I mean, he's certainly not like a First Great Awakening evangelical. He does participate in religious community, but not in a way that marks him as part of a religious awakening or anything like that.
Sure.
I think there's some important evidence for Madison's view of this on this question in the document itself. In the first paragraph, the first reason he gives why this bill should not pass, he's quoting the Virginia Declaration of Rights, but he says, "Religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, in the manner of discharging it, can be directed reason and conviction, not by force or violence. This right is in its nature an unalienable right. It is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men." And then in the both in the fourth and in the sixth reasons he gives for opposing Henry's bill, again he returns to this. He uses the phrase evidence. Minds have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. So I think if by deist you mean, and can be, I'm not quite, we'd have to define that term, but for Madison, I think it's very important, this emphasis on reason and evidence presented to your mind, creating a conviction, which then becomes the basis of your conscience or your religious understanding, is how he understood the process to work. And you can say that's a very enlightened or rationalistic approach to religion, and I think some people would say that. But I do think that's Madison's view. At least that's the view articulated in the Memorial and Remonstrance.
What sort of evidence do you suppose he might be talking about? What counts as evidence to convince one of religious belief?
It's a good question. Good question. So I'll turn it to Sarah to answer that.
Thanks so much. And now I'm like looking frantically at the text to see, does he give us any examples? I mean, it's interesting in that fourth point that David was just quoting from, where he says, we cannot deny an equal freedom to those whose minds have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. So without knowing exactly what he would have in mind, to me, just the phrasing of that suggests that although there is evidence and it is rational, that it's evidence that carries with it some kind of authority that the mind just has to be in the right state to receive, right? That it's not self-evident in the way the truths of the Declaration are, right? It's not entirely standing on its own, but it has something to do with the receptivity of the person who's either convinced or not. And so I think that it's got to be evidence that's more than just, here are these set of facts, the Bible is the most successful bestseller, whatever. That Madison is sort of hinting at a more spiritual or emotional response to evidence than just a rational response.
All right, because that's the section that really screamed deism to me, because, well, any deist would say the evidence of the watch tells us that there's a watchmaker, hence the existence of the universe tells us that there's a creator. On the other hand, we don't have evidence for the Immaculate Conception. We don't even have evidence for the Trinity or the resurrection of Christ. But okay, be that as it may. Sarah, you mentioned early on that one of the things that's really interesting about this is the emphasis, which one doesn't find in Jefferson, on the ways in which establishment of religion or state funding for religion actually is bad for religion itself. Could you and David each say a little bit more about that, please?
Do you want me to start, sir?
I have actually point 11 from the Remonstrance in front of me, so I could talk about that.
Okay.
So one of the things that Madison raises here is that the problem with establishments is that they create jealousies among different religious groups. And so any support, whether it's to one group or whether it's to, groups that are authorized, or, all groups that claim to be Christian, whatever it is going to create outsiders who are then going to be factious and trying to worm their way into the type of power relationships that the established or recognized religions have. And so Madison in point 11 talks about this. It will destroy that moderation and harmony which the forbearance of our laws to intermeddle with religion has produced, right? So it's going to cause these religious groups not just to disturb the peace of society, but also to disturb their internal peace, right? They're going to become more interested in these power relationships than doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Okay.
And then in point 6, his argument there in brief is that if you have to support the religion, it suggests to people that it can't. It has no evidence of its worth on its own. So it actually undermines confidence in religion to have state support for it. And then in the seventh point, he says, once you start this state support, then you actually start corrupting the ministers of religion because they start to compete for the benefits. And he says, what have been its fruits of this state support? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy. I mean, the clergy don't have to work hard because they get a state support, so they mumble their sermons and, et cetera, et cetera. Ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. That portrait may be a little overdrawn, but it is true that students of religion today will point to the continuation of state support in Europe as one reason why those Christian churches, have not flourished, and the lack of state support in the United States being a reason why Christianity continued to flourish and continues to flourish in the United States, because it bred a kind of need to be self-reliant, and if you want to say that, competitive and so forth, which kept a spirit alive in the Christian churches in America, which was not necessary in Europe, and therefore those churches did lose a kind of vigor that they should have had.
We have another question.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and Madison kind of makes that his 12th point too, to talk about the fact that there's no incentive for evangelism if the church is established, right? If it's going to be supported, regardless of whether it actually appeals to the public, then they have no incentive to spread the gospel, which is theoretically the whole point of these different denominations.
And indeed, elsewhere he says we'll actually lose believers simply because they'll leave the state. They'll head to a different one where there is no established religion. Certainly that's what believers in other sects are going to do. And Europeans, presumably looking across the Atlantic, will say, well, we might as well stay home or go anywhere but Virginia if we do plan on leaving.
Right.
There's another question relevant to what we're talking about. How common were establishments elsewhere in the colonies pre-independence, and how common were they during the first years of the Republic under the Constitution? When did they cease to exist altogether in the United States?
Maybe I could make a plug here. If there is a website that Sarah and I have been working on called Religion in American History and Politics, which is connected to the TAH website. And on that religion website, there is a chart which shows how complex, say from 1776 to 1840, it covers roughly those years, how complex this question was about religion in the states. So the last state establishment is in Massachusetts, right? So that's 1833 when it disappears. Is that right, Sarah?
Yeah, that's what I remember.
Many states in 1777, some states did away with their establishment, and there were only 3 states, Sarah, 2 colonies, 2 or 3 that did not have an establishment.
Yeah, so Rhode Island has the sort of least established. I don't think they have any real guidelines, and then Pennsylvania has a relatively loose, believing in the God of the Old and New Testaments. So they allowed, kind of encapsulate Jews in there. And Georgia, I want to say, maybe.
Right. I think Georgia. So that question is difficult to answer because there was a lot of, what's the term, fluidity. I mean, I think it's always important to remember that there never had been a place that had adopted this principle of religious liberty, certainly not in the way it was understood. And so people didn't know quite. There isn't a sense in which people were experimenting. So some states prohibited ministers from holding public office. Some states had test oaths. Others did not. There's a lot of variability from state to state.
All right. Presumably, it was not always the Church of England that, for example, Massachusetts would have supported the Congregationalist sect over others. What was there any kind of uniformity in the sense of which sects were discriminated against? I think Quakers and Mennonists, presumably Mennonites, come up in this document. What were often the minority sects that were I don't know if persecuted is too strong a word, but discriminated against, and why?
So I think it's really important to think about why, right? So the two groups that are mentioned here, the Quakers and the Mennonites or Mennonists, are both pacifist groups, and so particularly, in this time of revolution, or just coming out of the revolution, it's really difficult to understand how a group that is doctrinally asserting that God is against violence can be relied upon to participate in the defense of the Commonwealth, right? So pacifist religious groups are suspect because you can't expect them to take up the responsibility, the duty of every other active citizen to protect the state. So those groups are out of bounds for that reason. Papists, nobody likes the Catholics sort of historically in the Anglo-American tradition. They're hierarchical in their government. They have this, all the way up to JFK, right? The fear that he will be controlled by the Pope as president. So people don't understand the hierarchy. They don't trust the hierarchy. David, other groups?
Well, the Baptists, I think you could say, were, I wouldn't say persecuted, but discriminated against, in the sense that because they operated outside the establishment, they would pay taxes, for example, that would support an establishment, but not their own church. And the Baptists were historically opposed to any kind of civil support for religion. So they took that as as an acceptable result of adhering to the Christianity they preferred, but still it amounted to a kind of discrimination. And there may even have been social, you might say social discrimination, if not legal discrimination, in seeing certain, Baptists or some other Protestant groups as maybe socially inferior in certain ways, in part because of the religion they held. They weren't quite part of the established way of life in a colony.
One of the things.
Yeah, and the Baptist in Virginia. Sorry, John.
Please go ahead. They're here to listen to you, not me.
No, so I was just going to say, yeah, the Baptists in Virginia are particularly a problem because they tend to be itinerant, and so they're going in and out of other parishes that have ministers who are expecting their congregants to be in their services on Sunday mornings, and so there's kind of a loss of face element. So yeah, that social tension between these outsiders and the clergy who have the social role that they think is theirs, justifiably or not, is a big deal.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Sarah, to emphasize the itinerant character of, and later Methodists, of course, that was something distinctive from these more established churches.
I know that certain of the Anabaptist sects, I know, for example, the Brethren Church, because Ashland University has a historic connection to that church. The Brethren are known for being non-creedal. And I think the same can be said for the Mennonites. I'm not sure about the Quakers, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear that the Quakers were also non-creedal. And I'm wondering if that might not have had something to do with the concern, right? You in those faiths, you do not say here. You don't have a statement of beliefs that we must all adhere to. That could well have been a source of discrimination. What other sorts of arguments do we find in the Remonstrance that are worthy of or that you think are most worthy of mention here?
Well, I just, if I could for a moment, point out something about the overall structure. And I don't know if Sarah would agree with this, but the way I read the document, there's a first point which makes the broadest and deepest claim about the status of religious liberty, which we should return to because I think it's striking. And then the second point that he makes, the paragraph number 2, follows from that first claim. And then there's a kind of, number 3 is a kind of slippery slope argument. Then Madison makes an argument about equality in 4. In 5, he makes an argument about the limit of the power of the magistrate. And then from 6 on, there follow 8 different reasons why an establishment of religion or just even support the way the bill proposed is a bad thing. And those mix bad for civil life and bad for religious life. And then the final 2, 14 and 15, 14 raises a question about the method of adopting such a proposal. And then 15 returns really to the fundamental claim made in the first numbered paragraph by raising this question of usurpation of the rights of Virginia's citizens. And Madison saying, if we accept this, we're going to lose trial by jury. We're going to, because how can the legislature take away a fundamental right? If we allow this right to be abridged, then slowly, our other rights can be abridged. So there is a structure to the Memorial and Remonstrance, I believe. I don't know that it's evident to everybody in the first or second reading, but I think, Madison had a very powerful and logical mind, and there is a structure to the Memorial and Remonstrance. I don't know if Sarah would agree with the way I laid it out, but that's how I see it. So an opening of 4 or 5 kind of fundamental claims about liberty, and then a series of 8 statements about very practical bad consequences for government and church, and then 2 concluding statements which bring it back to the level of fundamental rights.
I think that's very insightful, David, and I think hearing you lay it out that way, I think that's absolutely right. And I do want to talk about those fundamental rights portions, and also just to briefly connect that to the structure of the bill for establishing religious freedom that ultimately comes into this discussion. It's section 3, I think, is reminiscent of Madison's first 2 and concluding sections, in as much as they say, we understand that legislatures can do what they want, yet we are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of man, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right. So the poignancy of this idea of inalienability, and sort of, we know that legislatures can and do enact laws that infringe on the rights of the people, but here we want to just make it clear that we think that's a terrible idea, and that this is a law that should not pass, and should not be revoked, and the one that actually does protect the rights.
Yeah, you were reading from the tail end, the very end of the Statute for Religious Liberty. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, which maybe we want to start to bring in these 2 Jefferson readings. There's a couple of, or at least one thing that that struck me on number 8. This is where he's talking about the overall point is the establishment in question is not necessary for the support of civil government, and goes on to say that in fact it hurts civil government. Skipping down a few lines, what influence in fact have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of the civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instance have they been seen as the guardians of the liberties of the people. I mean, we could all think of plenty of examples of unions of throne and altar in Europe. Do either of you have any idea what he's thinking of in saying, in some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of the civil authority.
You mean a historical example of that?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a really good question, John.
I think that my sense is you would have to go outside European history to see that.
Okay.
He may be thinking of, what they used to refer to as Oriental despotisms.
Might well.
Because it's in European history, I think there were always means for the for kings to resist the Pope, although you can find instances where the Pope had the upper hand at certain points. Typically, if he did, it didn't last for very long, and there was always never quite that merger of church and state that occurred in other places. And certainly once the Reformation occurred, it became impossible to assert a kind of religious authority over civil authority.
Yeah, well, the Catholic Church's position has always been, hey, separation of church and state. We invented separation of church and state. Right? All right. What can we say about these Jefferson pieces and how obviously they both, actually, they don't both predate the Memorial and Remonstrance. His notes in the state of Virginia certainly do, and the Statute of Religious Freedom comes slightly afterward. What should we be paying attention to here?
And remind me of which of the two Jefferson documents you're talking about, John?
We've got the notes of the state of Virginia, right? Is this excerpt from the notes of the state of Virginia from 1781, and then the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, 1786.
Right. And the excerpt and the from notes on the state of Virginia, it's the
Query 17, religion, where he gives something of a history of religion in Virginia up to this point, talking about establishment, the dominance of the English church, the intolerance toward the Presbyterians and the Quakers, etc. I don't know. Maybe you don't have those.
Yeah. Well, to me, I think that the Statute of Religious Liberty, the principal thing about that is the opening statement about the mind being free. To me, that is very much in accord with the way Madison talks in the Remonstrance when he puts the emphasis on reason, evidence. I think that shows a similarity with Jefferson. And the history he provides in Notes on the State of Virginia, I think, is again meant to show, as Madison tries to highlight in a couple of these passages in the Remonstrance, about the bad effect of mixing church and state. So those documents, I think, are very much the similarity between Jefferson and Madison in the way they thought about. I believe they're the basis of what they understood to be religious experience, and also the problem with mixing it with politics.
Okay.
I would totally agree with that. And I would add that another place that they agree is on the radical nature of religious liberty. So that, we were talking about groups that were persecuted and why they were persecuted, and it was because of the perceived danger to the state or the common beliefs of society, or the good functioning of the society by certain of their doctrines. And in both the Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom and in this little reflective essay, Jefferson makes quite clear that the only thing the state can regulate is action, right? So we can say we're not going to allow certain types of religious practice, but we cannot say we're going to compel you to believe or disbelieve in anything. And this is that famous quote: "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." Right? That ironically, for a man who clearly believes ideas have power, he's sort of rhetorically denying the significance of the idea to make the broader point that the idea has to be free.
Mm-hmm. A couple of things that strike me from the notes on the state of Virginia. First of all, religious uniformity is never going to be accomplished. So in a way, this whole enterprise is a waste. Millions of innocent men, women, and children, since the introduction of Christianity, have been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. Yet we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth. And then he goes down to talk about the lack of establishment in Pennsylvania and New York. This experiment was new and doubtful when they made it. It has answered beyond conception. They flourish infinitely. Religion is well supported, of various kinds indeed, but all good enough, all sufficient to preserve peace and order. Or if a sect arises whose tenets would subvert morals, good sense has fair play and reasons and laughs it out of doors without suffering the state to be troubled with it. So even those rare occasions when a goofy religion appears that really would be dangerous, excuse me, anybody with a lick of sense sees how stupid the whole thing's and just dismisses it out of court. I care to comment on either of those passages?
Well, I would say that there's a kind of if anyone listening in knows Steve Knott, this is the kind of thing that would start Knott spluttering, because he would point out that Jefferson took that view towards religious opinion, but he didn't take that view. Well, he did in a way take that view towards political opinion. That is to say, reason is powerful and the truth will prevail. We just have to have debate, the marketplace of ideas, a kind of traditional liberal view of these things. Yet Jefferson always worked behind the scenes to make sure that his own political opinions prevailed, and he would often...
That's just advertising.
Yeah, well, he would often say to Madison, pick up your pen and, attack Hamilton. And, so you could just say he was organizing the debate, the political debate. But he cared much, I would say, he cared much less about religious views. And he believed, I think, that the major benefit of freedom of religion is that there would be a proliferation of sects and churches and so forth, and that they would police each other in a way. It's not unlike the factionalism argument in Federalist 10, which Jefferson, that view of things Jefferson shared with Madison, and he was very willing to allow that view to prevail when it came to religious opinion, but he recognized a limit to it, I think, when it came to political opinion. But with regard to religious opinion, he thought that it actually could work without any, the invisible hand of the religious marketplace would work wonderfully.
Is that because Jefferson simply thought religion was less important?
My opinion is that he thought that there was such a thing as a rational religion, and that over time, as these debates continued, religion would become more and more rational in his view of it. And therefore, those religious opinions more commonly held. And you would always probably have some fringe elements espousing strange ideas, but there would be a kind of broad agreement and on religious views. And I think there's something like that actually happened, because the Protestant churches worked out a kind of set of views, even though they may differ on certain points of doctrine and practice. There was a kind of broad Protestant establishment that was more than just a social grouping. It really held certain tenets generally in common, and there are various ways you could express those, or people might have a different list. But I think there was a way in which that happened, and what changed that really was immigration, which brought more and more Catholics and also versions of Christianity from Southern Europe and so forth, which were different from the Christianity known in Northern Europe. I mean, so that gets to a much later period in American history. But say antebellum America, I think there was generally a kind of consensus view of what religion condoned and what it didn't, that did broadly prevail.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, with this passage that you read, John, in particular, and it's Jefferson writing it, but it's definitely something that Madison shares. When he comes home from Princeton, he comes home, through the Middle Colonies, spends some time with a friend, William Bradford, who's from Pennsylvania. And he writes to Bradford after he gets back to Virginia about a persecution of, I think, Baptist, actually, neighbors of his, and just sort of the waste of time and public energy and, the dissension it causes in the community, that Madison just thinks needn't have happened, right? That if we didn't have these ridiculous establishment laws, then we wouldn't have had all of this upheaval, and we wouldn't have people pitting themselves against the state and against their neighbors. And so, I think the idea in this passage is also that if we allow these conversations to happen away from the rule of law, then not necessarily do they matter less, but they have less riding on them in terms of civil penalties or so forth. And so it's easier to be good neighbors and good fellow citizens if you're not worried about getting thrown in jail because of what you believe, or you don't think that your neighbor should be thrown in jail because of what they believe.
Okay.
Right. John, could we? I would like to look at the argument in that the paragraph numbered 1, because I think it makes
in the Memorial and Remonstrance.
Yeah, in the Memorial and Remonstrance, we have about 10 minutes left or so.
Sure.
Is that right? Okay. So, I mean, he quotes the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It's reason and conviction that give us our understanding of what we owe to the Creator. And then he says, therefore, it's the right of every man to exercise this right of conscience as his religion as his conscience may dictate. Then he says this right is in its nature unalienable, and he gives 2 reasons for this. He says, first, it is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. So I can't give up my right of conscience, my right to determine my religious views, because they are the result of my own reason working on the evidence as it is presented to me. And nobody else has that experience, and therefore I can't give up that right. I can't rely on somebody else's reason. I have to rely on my own. And you could argue, I think you can argue against that view, and then his second reason, it is unalienable because what is here a right towards men is a duty towards the Creator. It is the duty of every man to render the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. And then this sentence, this duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. So Madison is saying that every individual's understanding of his duty to God is a stronger claim, both or a precedent claim, both in order of time and in degree of obligation to any civil claim. So one reason this, I think it's important to think about this. If courts cite the Memorial and Remonstrance, if they really believe what Madison argues here, then should they not, and should not all Americans want the greatest possible respect for religious liberty? In other words, there can be, he's really saying that our civil claims are subordinate to the claim that we believe the Creator has on us. And that claim in our own minds is a stronger obligation than any civil claim. I think that's I don't know what the right term would be, a radical claim, a very powerful claim. And if you thought about it, it seems to me it would mean that we should do as little as possible to infringe on religious liberty, freedom of conscience. So I think it's worth pointing out, this is a very, very strong claim in the Memorial and Remonstrance. It seems to me a very strong claim for religious liberty.
So on the one hand, our responsibilities to our Creator are prior to, and henceforth more important than our responsibilities to the civil authority. Nevertheless, we are free to determine the nature of that obligation.
Right.
So that the right to believe is a logical extension of our right to think. Very interesting.
Yeah, and that's why, again, that statement, the human mind is free, the statement in Jefferson's account of religious liberty is so important. And I think this is Madison's version of that claim. You might say it's a less poetic rendering of that claim, but it has the same kind of force, I think, as the claim that Jefferson made. And it is, again, I think, a very strong claim that within civil society, religious liberty must receive the maximum possible respect from the power of the state.
We have a question about separation of church and state. Do Madison and Jefferson have a problem with church and state, or is it rather with the conflation of state and church?
So I'm not 100% sure I'm clear on the difference between those two things, but I'll take a stab at what I think the difference might be. And I would say that what David's been talking about in the last few minutes about the precedence of our religious obligations to what Madison refers to as the Creator, make it impossible for the state to control the church, because the state can't supersede our obligation to God, right? And I think that the remainder of point 1, and you can draw out from point 2 and 3 also, that Madison in the Memorial is kind of leaving open the idea that it would actually be well within the theory of the revolution and our rights of resistance for religious dissenters who find that the state is oppressing them to take up arms, right? That they would have every reason to act to defend their religious rights just the same way that other that the Americans in the time of the Revolution acted to defend other rights, right? So that there can't be an oppression, there cannot be a state that controls the church, or you're opening up this huge political problem. I'm not sure if that's.
Well, I would add that Jefferson, they wanted a separation of church and state, but the other way to think about this is religion and politics, and those are not separable. And nobody, as far as I know, has ever argued. Not nobody, but typically the founders don't argue that religion and politics should be separate. What they argue is that the institutions, state and church, should be separate. So, Jefferson himself, who was considered by certain Federalists a kind of, arch fiend of atheism, often used the Bible or would use images from the Bible and so forth because he knew the people he was talking to understood that language and were very familiar with it. And I don't say he was doing that in a manipulative way, but he was doing it in a way to try to communicate with people. And there are lots of examples. I mean, Jefferson himself proposed Moses leading the people to the promised land at one point for the Great Seal of the United States. And again, I don't think he was doing that cynically. I think he realized how he understood, the opinions of Americans, and he was trying to communicate and so forth. And there are other examples I think you can draw on. The use of chaplains in the House of Representatives, and all those things that people cite. But church and state, I don't think there's any question but that the founders wanted those separate, and that conviction deepened and grew, as I say, as people experimented with and came to understand what the various, not just the First Amendment in the Constitution, but in the state constitutions, the equivalent language in the state constitutions. When people came to understand what that meant and thought about it, I think they saw more and more the advantages that Madison lays out in the Memorial and Remonstrance, the advantages in separating church and state. But it didn't mean and doesn't have to mean a separation of politics and religion.
Sorry about that. I had my microphone muted. I wanted to see if there were any last comments by either panelist on this subject.
No, I think that it's a really it's a deep document. I think it bears reading and rereading, especially with the idea of the structure that David suggested, to think about beginning and ending with the philosophical arguments, and then just the practical in the middle is, I think, a very helpful way of looking at it, because although the practical elements of the argument may not seem as relevant in 2018 as they did in the 1780s, the philosophical framework, I think, would hold up to other types of practical examples.
That is all the time we have. I want to thank both of our panelists as well as our participants for their questions. Just a reminder that you will be receiving an email with a link for a certificate of participation, should you like one. If you have enjoyed today's seminar, please consider taking an online graduate course through the Ashbrook Center. These are offered as part of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program, a program that is near and dear to all of our hearts. You can find more information about Ashbrook's online course offerings at teachingamericanhistory.org. You can help us spread the word about these programs by sharing the archive link, which you'll be receiving by email next week. Share that with your colleagues as well as on social media. We would appreciate it. Our next Documents in Detail webinar will be Wednesday, September 19th. At that time, our subject will be excerpts from James Madison's Notes of Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787. At that time, I'll be joined by Dr. Jeremy Bailey of the University of Houston and Dr. Gordon Lloyd of Pepperdine University. The recommended readings for that webinar have already been posted, and we hope to see you back here on September 19th. Thank you all, and have a pleasant evening.